The Long Ships. Part 2. In King Ethelred's Kingdom. Chapter 1, concerning the battle that was fought at Maldon, and what came after it. Continued. The Vikings buried their dead, and pledged them, and the victory they had won. They handed Byrhtnoth's corpse over to the sorrowful envoys who came to beg for it, that they might give it Christian burial. Then they sent proclamations to Maldon and other towns in the district, commanding that the inhabitants should pay fire tribute and ransom without delay, lest a heavier penalty be demanded of them. They rejoiced at the thought of so much wealth lying in store for them, counting it already as their own, and their anger mounted as the days passed, and no Englishman came with surrender and gold. So they rode up to Maldon, and set fire to the stockade on the river bank, and stormed the town and sacked it fearfully. Then they wept, because so much had been burned that there was little left for booty. They swore that in the future they would be more sparing in their use of fire, for it was silver that they yearned for, and not destruction, which swallowed up silver with all else. And they set to work to whip in horses from the whole district, that they might the more speedily descend on those parts of the land which reckoned themselves safe from the invaders' wrath. Soon bands of them rode forth in all directions, and returned to the camp laden with booty, and there was now such dire panic throughout the land that no chieftain dared to emulate Byrhtnoth and challenge them to battle. Prisoners whom they took reported that King Ethelred was sitting pasty-faced behind his walls, mumbling prayers with his priests, wholly raideless. In the church at Maldon, which was of stone, some of the English were still holding out. They had fled up into the tower when the Vikings had stormed the city, priests and women being among them, and they had drawn the steps up with them as they ascended, that they might not be pursued into their retreat. The Vikings suspected that they had taken much treasure with them, and strove their utmost to persuade them to descend from their tower and bring their treasure with them. But neither by fire nor by force of arms could they achieve anything, and the people had plenty of food and drink with them in the tower, and sang psalms, and appeared to be in good heart. When the Vikings approached the tower to try to induce them by words to act sensibly and come down and part with their treasure, they cast down stones, curses, and filth upon their heads, yelling with triumph when any of their missiles met their mark. All the Vikings agreed that stone churches and their towers were among the most vexatious obstacles that a man could find himself confronted with. Yostein, who was an old, hard man, very greedy for gold, said that he could think of only one way to break down these people's obstinacy, namely, that they should bring their prisoners to within sight of the tower, and there kill them, one by one, until the people in the tower could endure it no more, and so would be forced to surrender. A number of the men agreed with him in this, for he had a great name for wisdom. But Gudmund and Thorkel thought such a plan unwarrior-like, and were unwilling to be parties to it. It would be better, said Thorkel, to bring them down by guile. He added that he was well acquainted with the foibles of priests, and knew how best to approach them, and get them to do what one wanted. He ordered his men to remove a great cross from above the altar in the church. Then he approached the tower, with 2 men carrying the cross before him, and, halting at its foot, cried up to the people there that he needed priests to tend the wounded, and also, which was more urgent, to instruct him personally in the Christian faith. Of late, he explained, he had begun to feel strongly attracted toward the new religion, and he would act toward them as though he was already a Christian, for he would allow everyone in the tower to leave it unscathed in life and limb. He had proceeded thus far in his discourse when a stone shot out of the tower and struck his shield arm near the shoulder, knocking him to the ground and breaking his arm. At this the two men dropped the cross and assisted him to safety, while the people in the tower cheered in triumph. Jostin, who had been watching, curled his lip and observed that guile in war was not such a simple matter as inexperienced young men sometimes appeared to imagine. All Thorkel's followers were inflamed with fury at seeing their chieftain wounded thus, and flights of arrows were loosed at the loopholes in the tower, but this achieved nothing, and the situation appeared to be insoluble. Orm said that in the Southland he had sometimes seen Al-Mansur's men drive Christians from their church towers by smoking them out, and they at once set to work to try to do this. Wood and wet straw were piled together inside the church and around the foot of the tower and were lit, but the tower was high, and a breeze dispersed most of the smoke before it could ascend. In the end, the Vikings lost patience and decided to leave things until the inhabitants of the tower should begin to feel the pangs of hunger. Thorkel was dejected by the failure of his stratagem, and feared lest his men should taunt him on the subject. Apart from this, he was irked at the prospect of having to sit idly in Malden guarding the camp, for it was clear that it would be some time before he would be able to ride out and plunder, and he was anxious that men knowledgeable in medicine should come and examine his injury. Orm came to commiserate with him as he sat before a fire drinking mulled ale, with his broken arm hanging at his side. Many men thumbed his arm, but none of them knew how to put it in splints. Thorkel groaned uncomfortably as they thumbed the fracture, and said it would be medicine enough for the moment if they could bind up his arm as well as it would allow, with or without splints. "Now the words I spoke at the foot of the tower have come true," he said. "I need a priest badly, for priests understand such matters as this." Orm nodded in agreement, and said that the priests were cunning doctors. After the Yule feast at King Harald's, he had had a much worse wound than Thorkel's, healed by a priest. Indeed, he added, he would welcome a priest no less than Thorkel, for the blow he had received on his skull from a shoed club was causing him incessant headaches, so that he was beginning to wonder whether something might not have come loose inside his head. When they were alone, Thorkel said to him, "I hold you to be the wisest of my ship's captains, and the best warrior too, now that Fair Wide is dead. Nonetheless, it is clear that you easily lose your courage when your body is afflicted, even when the injury is but a slight one." Orm replied, "It is so with me that I am a man who has lost his luck. Formerly my luck was good, for I survived unscathed more dangers than most men face in the whole of their lives, and emerged from all of them with profit. But since I returned from the Southland, everything has gone wrong for me. I have lost my gold chain, my sweetheart, and the man whose company pleased me best. And as for battle, it has come to such a pass that nowadays I can scarcely draw my sword without coming to some harm. Even when I advised you to smoke these English out of their church tower, nothing came of it." Thorkel said that he had seen unluckier men than Orm, but Orm shook his head sadly. He sent his men off plundering with Rapp in command, and remained himself in the town with Thorkel, spending most of the time sitting by himself and contemplating his woes. One morning, not long afterwards, the bells in the church tower rang long and loud, and the people there sang psalms very zealously, causing the Vikings to shout up and ask them what all the fuss might be about. The people had no stones left to throw down at them, but they shouted back that it was now Whitsun, and that the day was for them a day of rejoicing. The Vikings found this reply astonishing, and several of them asked the English what on earth they could have to rejoice about, and how they were placed as regards meat and ale. They replied that in that matter things were as they were, Nevertheless, they would continue to rejoice, because Christ was in heaven and would surely help them. Thorkel's men roasted fat sheep over their fires, and the odor of roasting was wafted up to the tower, where all the people were hungry. The men cried up to them to be sensible and come down and taste their roast, but they paid no attention to this invitation, and began shortly to sing afresh. Thorkel and Orm sat munching together, listening to the singing from the tower. "Their singing is hoarser than usual," said Thorkel. "They are beginning to get dry in the throat. If their drink is finished, it cannot be long before they will have to come down." "Their plight is worse than mine, and yet they sing," said Orm, and he contemplated a fine piece of mutton mournfully before putting it in his mouth. "I think you would make a poor songster in any church tower," said Thorkel. The same day, around dinner-time, Gudmund returned from a Viking inland. He was a large, merry man, with a face that still bore traces of old wounds he had received when a bear had clawed him, and he now rode into the camp, drunken and voluble, with a costly scarlet cloak flung across his shoulders, 2 heavy silver belts around his waist, and a broad grin in the centre of his yellow beard. "This," he cried, as soon as he spied Thorkel, "was a land after his own heart, wealthy beyond imagination. As long as he lived, he would never cease to be grateful to Thorkel for having tempted him to come here. He had plundered 9 villages and a market, losing only 4 men. His horses were tottering beneath the weight of their booty, though only the choicest articles had been selected, and following them were ox carts loaded with strong ale and other delicacies. It would be necessary in due course, he added, to get a hold of several more ships, with plenty of cargo room, to take home all the booty that they could, in a short time and with little expense of effort, have gathered in this excellent land. Besides all this," he concluded, "I found a procession of people on the road, 2 bishops and their suites. They said they were envoys from King Ethelred, so I offered them ale and bade them follow me here. The bishops are old and ride slowly, but they should be here soon, though what they can want with us is not easy to guess. They say they are coming with an offer of peace from their king, but it is we and not he who shall decide when there is to be peace. I suspect that they will also want to teach us Christianity, but we shall have little time to listen to their teaching with such fine plunder to be had everywhere." Thorkel roused himself at these tidings, and said that the priests were what he had most need of just now, for he was anxious to get his arms set properly, and Orm, too, was pleased at the prospect of being able to talk to a priest about his sore head. "But I shall not be surprised," Thorkel said, "if the errand on which they have come is to ransom our prisoners and those people up in the tower." A short while afterwards the bishops rode into the town. They were of venerable aspect, with staffs in their hands and hoods covering their heads. They had with them a great company of outriders and priests, grooms and stewards, and musicians, and they pronounced the peace of God upon all who met their eye. All of Thorkel's men who were in the camp came to gaze at them, but some shrank away when the bishops raised their hands. The people in the tower broke into loud acclamations at the sight of them, and began again to ring their bells. Thorkel and Gudmund showed them every hospitality, and when they had rested and had given thanks to God for their lucky journey, they explained their mission. The bishop, who appeared to be the senior of the two, and who was called the Bishop of St. Edmund's Bury, addressed Thorkel and Gudmund and such others of the Vikings as had gathered to hear what he had to say. These, he said, were evil times, and it was a great grief to Christ and his church that men did not know how to live peacefully with one another in love and tolerance. Fortunately, however, he continued, they now had in England a king who loved peace above all other things, and this despite the magnitude of his power and the legions of warriors that lay awaiting his command. He preferred to win the love of his enemies rather than to destroy them by the sword. King Ethelred regarded the Northmen as zealous young men who lacked counsel and did not know what was best for them, and, after having consulted his own wise counselors, he had decided on this occasion not to march out against them and to put them to the sword, but rather to point out peacefully to them the error of their ways. He had accordingly sent his envoys to find out how the gallant chieftains of the north and their followers could be persuaded to turn their thoughts toward peace and abandon the dangerous paths which they were now treading. It was King Ethelred's desire that they should return to their ships and depart from his coasts to dwell in their own land in peace and contentment, and to facilitate this and to win their friendship for all time, he was ready to give them such presents as would fill them all with joy and gratitude. Such royal munificence would, he trusted, so soften the hardness of their young hearts that they would learn to love God's holy law and Christ's gospel. If this should come to pass, good King Ethelred's joy would know no bounds, and his love for them would become even greater. The bishop was bent with age and toothless, and few of the Vikings could understand what he said, but his words were translated for them by a wise priest of his suite, and all those who stood there listening turned and stared about at one another in bewilderment. Gudmund was seated on an ale butt, drunken and contented, rubbing a little gold cross to polish it, and when they explained to him what the bishop had said, he began to rock backwards and forwards with delight. He shouted to Thorkel that the latter should lose no time in replying to this excellent discourse. So Thorkel replied, in a manner befitting a chieftain. He said that what they had just heard was without doubt something worth pondering. King Ethelred had already a great name in the Danish kingdom, but it now appeared that he was an even finer king than they had been led to believe, and this proposal of his, to give them all presents, accorded well with the opinion of his worth that they had hitherto held. For, he continued, as we told Jarl Byrhtnoth when we spoke with him across the river, you who dwell in this land are rich, and we poor seafarers are only too anxious to be your friends, if you will but share your wealth with us. It is good to hear that King Ethelred himself shares our feelings in this matter, and seeing that he is so rich and powerful and full of wisdom, I do not doubt that he will show himself and most liberal towards us. How much he intends to offer us we have not yet been told, but we need a lot to make us merry, for we are a melancholy race. I think it best that his gifts should take the form of gold and minted silver, for this will be easiest to count, and easiest too for us to carry home. While everything is being settled, we shall be glad if he will permit us to remain here undisturbed, taking from the district what we need for our upkeep and pleasure. There is, though, someone who has as much say in this matter as Gudmund and myself, and that is Jostein. He is at present away plundering with many of his followers, and until he returns, we cannot decide how large King Ethelred's gift is to be. But there is one thing I should like to know at once, and that is whether you have any priest skilled in medicine among your followers. For, as you see, I have this damaged arm, which needs plastering. The younger bishop replied that they had with them 2 men who were learned in the craft of healing, and said he would be glad to bid them attend to Thorkel's arm. He requested, however, that in return for this service, Thorkel should allow the people who were shut up in the tower to descend, and to go their ways without hindrance. For it was a heavy thing, he said, to think of them up there, tormented by hunger and thirst. As far as I'm concerned, said Thorkel, they can come down as soon as they like. We've been trying to persuade them to do so ever since we took this town, but they have resisted our offers most obstinately. In fact, it was they who broke my arm. Half of what they have in the tower they must give to us. This is small repayment for the injury to my arm, and to all the bother they have caused us. But when they have done that, they may go whithersoever they please. Soon, therefore, all the people in the tower descended, looking pale and wasted. Some of them wept and threw themselves at the bishop's feet, while others cried piteously for water and food. Thorkel's men were disappointed to find that there was little of value in the tower. Nevertheless, they gave them food and did them no harm. Orm happened to pass a water trough where a number of those who had been in the tower were drinking. Among them was a little bald man in a priest's cowl, with a long nose and a red scar across his forehead. Orm stared at him in astonishment. Then he went up and seized him by the shoulder. "I am glad to see you again," he said, "and I have something to thank you for since the last time we met. But I little thought to meet King Harold's physician in England. How did you come here?" "I came here from the tower," retorted Brother Willibald wrathfully, "where you heathen berserks have compelled me to spend the last fortnight." "I have several things to discuss with you," said Orm. "Come with me, and I will give you food and drink." "I have nothing to discuss with you," replied Brother Willibald. "The less I see of the Danes, the better it will be for me. That much at least I have learned by now. I will get my meat and drink elsewhere." Orm was afraid lest the little priest in his anger might dart away and give him the slip. So he picked him up and carried him away under one arm, promising him as he did so that no harm should come to him. Brother Willibald struggled vigorously, demanding sternly to be put down and informing Orm that leprosy and fearful battle wounds were the least retribution that would descend on any man who laid his hand on a priest. But Orm ignored his protests and carried him into a house he had chosen as his quarters after they had stormed the town, which now contained only a few members of his crew who had been wounded, and 2 old women. The little priest was obviously famished, but when meat and drink were placed before him, he sat for some time staring bitterly at the platter and tankard, making no effort to touch them. Then he sighed, muttered something to himself, made the sign of the cross over the food, and began to eat greedily. Orm refilled his tankard with ale, and waited patiently until Brother Willibald had appeased his hunger. The good ale appeared to have no soothing effect upon his temper, for the harshness of his retorts did not diminish. He found it in himself to answer Orm's questions, however, and before long he was talking as ebulliently as ever. He had escaped from Denmark, he explained, with Bishop Poppo, when the evil and unchristian King Sven had descended upon Jellinge to destroy God's servants there. The bishop, sick and fragile, was now living on the charity of the abbot of Westminster, grieving over the destruction of all of his work in the north. Brother Willibald, though, felt that there was in fact little to grieve about when you considered the matter aright, for there could be no doubt that what had happened was a sign from God, that holy men should cease their efforts to convert the heathens of the north, and should instead leave them to destroy one another by their evil practices, which were in truth past all understanding. For his own part, Brother Willibald added, he had no intention of ever again attempting to convert anyone from those parts, and he was prepared to proclaim that fact upon the cross and the passion of Christ in the presence of anyone who wished to hear it, including, if necessary, the Archbishop of Bremen himself. His eyes smouldering, he drained his tankard, smacked his lips, and observed that the ale was more nourishing than meat for a starving man. Orm refilled his tankard, and he continued with his story. When Bishop Poppo had heard that Danish Vikings had landed on the east coast of England, he had been anxious to try to learn from them how things were, now in the Danish kingdom, whether any Christians were still alive, whether the rumor that King Harold had died was true, and many other things besides. But the bishop had felt too weak to undertake the journey from Westminster himself, and so had sent Brother Willibald to get the information for him. "For the bishop told me I would run little risk of injury among the heathens, however inflamed their passions might be. He said they would welcome me on account of my knowledge of medicine, in addition to which there would be men among them who had known me at King Harold's court. I had my own feelings on the matter, for he is too good for this world, and knows you less well than I do. However, it is not seemly to contradict one's bishop, so I did as he bade me. I reached this town one evening, very exhausted, and after celebrating evensong, laid myself down to sleep in the church house. There I was waked by screaming and thick smoke, and men and women came running in half naked, crying that the foul fiends had descended on us. Fiends there were none, but worse adversaries, and it seemed to me that little was likely to be gained by greeting them with words of salutation from Bishop Poppo, so I fled with the rest up into the church tower, and there I should have perished, and the others with me, had God not elected to liberate us from our plight upon this blessed Whitsunday. He wagged his head mournfully and regarded Orm with weary eyes. Oh, this was 14 days ago, he said, and since then I have had little sleep, and my body is weak, nay, not weak, for it is as strong as the spirit that inhabits it. Still, there are limits to its strength. You can sleep later, said Orm impatiently. Do you know aught of what has happened to Ylva, King Harold's daughter? This much I know, replied Brother Willibald promptly, that unless she shortly mends her ways, she will burn in hell fire for her brazenness of spirit and scandalous conduct. And what hope can one cherish that any daughter of King Harold will ever mend her ways? Do you hate our women too? Asked Orm. What harm has she ever done to you? It matters little what she has done to me, said the little priest bitterly, though she did, in fact, call me a bold old owl, merely because I threatened her with the vengeance of the Lord. You threatened her, priest, said Orm, getting to his feet. Why did you threaten her? Because she swore that she would do as she pleased and marry a heathen, even though all the bishops in the world should strive to stop her. Orm clutched his beard and stared open-eyed at the little priest. Then he seated himself again. I am the heathen she wishes to marry, he said quietly. Where is she now? But he received no answer to his question that evening, for as he spoke, Brother Willibald drooped slowly down onto the table and fell fast asleep with his head upon his arms. Orm did his best to wake him, but in vain. At length he picked him up, carried him to the settle, laid him there and threw a skin over him. He noticed with surprise that he was beginning to grow fond of this little priest. For a while he sat alone, brooding over his ale. Then, as he found that he had no desire for sleep, his impatience began again to swell within him, and he got up, crossed over to the settle, and gave Brother Willibald a vigorous shaking. But Brother Willibald merely turned over in his sleep and muttered in a drowsy and peevish whisper, "Worse than fiends.